Hello, and welcome to this week's episode of the Refold Roundtable podcast, where we talk about the things you want us to talk about. And in this week's episode, we are talking about working with your language. My name is Bree, aka Briz, and I am a Spanish learner, and I don't really work with my language, and I'm not sure if I have any goals to. And we also have Shiki. Do you want to go ahead and say some words about yourself and introduce yourself?
Yeah, I'm Shiki, and I am a Japanese learner. Um, I have been interested, sort of, in interpretation and translation, but I'm not sure if I want to pursue it as a career. But I do see a language as a skill that you can take advantage of, so I'm interested in what Jimmy has to say.
Oh, me too. And Gorg, aka George, do you want
Uh,
to introduce
sure.
yourself?
So I'm George Pig, Gorg Pang, um, and I learn a bunch of different languages, and I actually do work with my languages. I've at various points taught Filipino, taught Spanish, and I now get to use Spanish when answering support emails for Refold clients and, just helping out. So, yeah, I do kind of work with my language, just not as an interpreter or as a translator.
And that brings us to our special guest of the day. You might have seen him around the Refold Mandarin server. He's the admin over there, Fighter, aka Jimmy. And the reason we invited Jimmy into the podcast today is because he actually has an extensive background of translating, like professionally, Mandarin content into English. So, Jimmy, do you want to go ahead and introduce yourself and kind of talk about how what you do?
Sure. So, hi everyone. I'm Jimmy, also known as Fighter on Refold, and I currently live in Taiwan. I do uh, professional translation work. Currently, it's mostly literary translation of like novels and short stories and stuff like that. But in the past, I've also done translation of a variety of things, including like a Chinese dating app, and I also here in Taipei, I study Chinese politics for my master's degree. So I guess in all respects, I am trying to fully integrate Chinese into my long-term career path.
It's awesome. That's incredible. I think there are a lot of people that are learning a language that maybe don't necessarily have any career goals, but on the same side, I think there are also tons of people who are definitely learning a language thinking about how they can use it in their career. So, how did you find these translation jobs? Did you seek them out or did they come to you? What's the story behind that?
Yeah. So with translation, it's been I don't know a bit of a journey for me. In the translation industry, in my view, the most important thing is always connections. Your connections determine kind of like what kind of jobs you'll get. If you can get the best jobs, they always come from your close connections typically.
Mm.
I got started with translation originally back in back in college. I took some translation classes then, and I also had some points then where I was living in China, like studying abroad, and like a lot of my Chinese friends, sometimes they would get me to translate stuff for them. Like one of my friends in China is the owner of a restaurant like chain there, and so he just had me create an English version of his menu, and that's kind of one of the ways it got started out. And then also in China, I used to intern for a publishing company there, which is like the biggest publisher of foreign literature in China. And so, as part of my internship duties, I often had to do translations of like either excerpts from novels that we would send to foreign publishers to see if they want to buy the publishing rights for them, or just like various other communications or documents. And after I graduated from college, I stayed in contact with that publishing company, and that's the main company I still work with nowadays for my translation work. They like basically contact me to do translations of some of their novels or other like stories they need translated. And besides that, after I finished college, I was originally doing a master's degree in translation and interpretation um, in the U.S., which I did that for a semester, and it was quite a good experience, quite a good school, um, and that's where I kind of picked up a lot of the more technical knowledge or theoretical knowledge, I guess, involved in translation and interpretation. But I left that after a semester to switch to politics instead. I definitely I like translation, but I just didn't want it to sort of I don't know do an entire degree in it, and so I just sort of treat translation as kind of like something fun for me to do besides my current politics master's degree right now.
Right. That makes a lot of sense. So you mentioned that you actually got a degree in translation, undergrad?
So in undergrad, I had some translation classes, but my degree
Gotcha.
was
Okay.
in Chinese and political science.
Wow. Okay. So what types of things did you learn in your translation classes that like what's covered in a translation class? That's seems pretty I didn't even know that they offered those as classes.
Yeah, so with translation classes, I guess you could kind of see it as there being two types, and this is also kind of dependent on the kind of school you go to. Basically, some translation majors, some translation classes will be far more theory based, while others are
Mm.
more a lot more practical. So by that I mean with theory based, for example, there's tons of books, there's tons of people who do research into translation theory, like what makes a good translation, what are some of the principles involved in translating, um like some of the most like this is constantly evolving, but like there's discussions into like how much is doing translation like a betrayal of the original work or something like that, just all this sort of stuff.
Oh,
um
that's intense. Okay.
yeah. And then there's also like the more practical classes, which at my school, it's much more practical. There is still some theory, but it's much more practical and I guess like job based. And so as part of that, I was really lucky because my professors at that translation school were all like really qualified people, like former UN translators or just like famous literary translators or whatever. And so I just got to kind of learn from them, like tips on translating sort of different styles of like documents or works. And like the one thing that I remember the most clearest about translation classes specifically is I had a professor there who's like he's a famous literary translator from Chinese into English, and he had this what he called the Aunt Betty rule, which means like basically when he translates Chinese like literature into English, he thinks about his Aunt Betty who like is an American who lives in the middle of nowhere and like doesn't know anything about foreign countries. And like the idea is that when you're translating a work, you should try to like kind of make your Aunt Betty like feel the same way that a reader in China feels, even if Aunt Betty knows nothing about China or Chinese literature or history or whatever.
Oh.
And so obviously you can't completely achieve that, but like the idea is like that's something you should strive for. And so that's the
So
kind
like
of
you're
stuff
also
that we
trying to
would learn.
translate the mood, like not just like the words, but like the entire mood, the entire like essence of it without having any of the cultural context as someone who doesn't understand Chinese.
Right, right, because like
Yeah.
you need to translate sort of the general feeling, and obviously you don't want the reader to go through like 100 footnotes per chapter just to understand everything.
Right. Yeah, that would be a little intense. So when you first started, how good at Chinese were you when you first started translation work?
Yeah, so when I got into like more serious sort of like paid translation work, and especially around the time when I was doing that translation degree, I mean, I would definitely consider myself like like fluent in the language, of course.
Yeah.
Of course, I'm still always like improving, but yeah, like I had no like issues. Like in terms of like Refold, it would be like definitely like a solid stage 4, because like a lot
Oh,
of
wow.
people ask me like when you're I get people asking me like what level of HSK, which is like the Chinese language test, similar to like JLPT for Japanese, or like what level of a certain language test should I be if I want to get into translation work or interpretation work. And obviously, these tests can have some value, especially for like work related purposes, visa related purposes. But I always tell people like just be the best you can possibly be, because like you don't want to have to be checking a dictionary all the time, or like missing out on certain idioms or cultural references that like aren't too esoteric or something like that. So you just want to be as prepared as you can possibly be.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And you mentioned that a lot of your work came from the connections that you made. How did you
Right.
primarily make those connections? Was that from your internship, or was that through friends or through work? What did you do to bolster that network, that translation network that you had?
Yeah, so my connections came definitely from the work. The publishing company was a big one. I made sure to stay in contact with all of my coworkers there. Just living in China and like letting friends know that I do translation work like was a good way to get some like odd jobs here and there, because like people would be like, oh yeah, I know this American guy who does translation, like he can maybe help you out. And also just from translation school, like even though I didn't complete that degree and I left after a semester, I still keep in contact with a lot of my classmates there, and once in a while they send me jobs. Like that's actually how I originally got my previous translation job at like one of China's biggest dating apps. Is one of my former classmates was like,
Wow.
yeah, one of my former classmates was like, she had this friend who worked at that company, and they were looking for a new like English translator, and so she just like passed that job offer my way, and that's how I got into that.
So, Jimmy, I have a question for you. I have worked not in China, but China adjacent for a while. And I've seen a lot of really poor translations and localizations from Chinese into English. So I always kind of had the impression that they tended to pay Chinese native speakers who were kind of competent in English to do sort of translations and localizations. So how is it that you were able to secure like a translating position in a language in a country where it seems like they're pretty okay with mediocre translations from non-native speakers?
Yeah, this is a good question actually. I the thing with translation in China is that you definitely do have plenty of companies who are perfectly okay with employing a native Chinese speaker to do translation into English, either because maybe they just want to save money, or uh, because I don't know, they just can't find a qualified English native. Because of course, this is a huge problem where you have tons of Chinese people learning English, but if you go in the other direction, native English speakers learning Chinese, especially native English speakers who are good enough to actually like translate, are not all that numerous. But yeah, you can definitely find companies that take things a lot more seriously. I mean, in terms of like professional translation, the ideal situation is that you should only be translating into your native language. You never translate into your non-native language. The only exception to this is in like interpretation, typically, or diplomatic interpretation, where you would interpret into your non-native language, but in terms of written translation, you typically only translate into your native language. And so, yeah, the main thing is you need to look for, I guess, I don't know what you would call it, quote unquote, more serious companies, or companies that have more at stake. So, for example, the publishing house that I work for, like obviously they don't want to be passing off shoddy translations to foreign publishers of literature. Like that would give a horrible impression of the literature. Um, and then with the dating app, they had a lot of money, they have a lot of resources, and so they were, at least at that time, they were only trying to employ native speakers for their translation to make it seem as professional as possible. So I mean, the main thing is like, of course, you do have plenty of instances and issues where people just find a Chinese native who their English might not be all that great to do the translation, but you can also, if you look hard enough and you know have some good connections, you can definitely find the better jobs that are willing to pay some extra money for an English native, because especially like with all this translation work that I've been doing, it's all remote, and so obviously living standards, the cost of living is a lot different between like China and like Taiwan or the US or whatever, and so typically employing a native English speaker will be often a bit more expensive, because English natives might who outside of China will probably be living in like the West or something where living costs are more expensive.
And do you feel like doing literary translation, you are more valuable than, say, translating the UI for an app or something where the level of English doesn't need to be as high?
Um, yeah, I don't know. This is kind of contradictory actually, because my job as a dating app translator actually paid far more than my current job as a literary translator. And so the thing is with literary translation, it seems like at least with Chinese, most literary translators agree that you can't make a full-time living out of it. Most like popular literary translators either do other freelance translation work, or they're like professors of literature who just do translation on the side or something like that. Um, and so, yeah, I mean, even though literary translation, I would say, is definitely much more difficult, and involves definitely a much higher ability in terms of your English ability and whatnot. That's not necessarily reflected in terms of, I don't know, how you're compensated for it, or sort of how you're treated as a translator, which is quite interesting to me.
All right. Well, that is definitely counterintuitive.
So I had a question that I was curious about. Um, I'm kind of wondering how you came to the whole translation job, because you kind of have to have some kind of interest, I feel like, that's like adjacent somehow to go into that career path. So, for instance, how I got into Refold was helping people. I enjoy helping people. And then that brought me to the job that I do now with Refold, is helping people uh, figure out how to learn their languages. So I'm wondering what kind of interests you had that kind of led you to doing translation work, and thinking of it like an idea, like, oh, I want to be a translator.
Yeah, so with this, I think if you want to be a translator, of course, like similar to what you were saying, like wanting to help people is definitely kind of a good adjacent interest to have, because you're always helping people to, you're helping to facilitate understanding. Another thing is like most translators and interpreters I know, and like I guess I would include myself in this, are people who love, I don't know, just love learning a lot, love reading a lot, even about like things that are not necessarily directly correlated to their interests. Just because if the thing is, if you want to be a good translator, people think like you need to people focus on your target language more than uh a native language, and by that I mean like people always talk about like how good in my target language do I need to be to do translation. But what people often forget is you also need to be really good in your native language as well. And by that I mean you need to be really well read in your native language. You need to be able to express yourself really well. I mean, if you only just read like social media posts in your native language all day, you're not going to be necessarily prepared for literary translation if you haven't read a ton of novels in your native language. And so you need to not only be working on your target language abilities, but also your native language abilities all the time. And that's obviously something that can come from like a lot of reading and learning in your native language. And then, yeah, with just helping people, like you need to be, willing to help people foster communication. Um, like back in the day, once like I would always help, I don't know, just friends around me to communicate. Like I had a Canadian friend who came to China once, and it was actually pretty cool. We were in a bar and we were talking, and then apparently sitting next to us was like a Taoist priest or like a Taoist monk, and he started talking with us about philosophy, and I had to like help my friend like interpret for my Canadian friend because he didn't speak any Chinese, and so just like stuff like that where like you're helping people to communicate when they normally wouldn't be able to is something that is a good quality to have. Just like enjoying that feeling of helping people.
Yeah, so it's interesting to me that you mentioned that you kind of need to be good at English and English composition and have a good English ability to do like translation work or at least literary translation. And it reminds me of like being a patent lawyer. To be a patent lawyer, you have to both be an engineer and a lawyer. So to be a translator to a high degree, it sounds like you have to be good at copywriting or literary writing, as well as being good at your target language or Chinese in your case.
Right.
So,
And I mean, a lot of people like when they sometimes people ask me like, I'm going to college, like should I major in a language? Does having a language major help me at all or anything like and with that I always tell people like just if you can like do a double major, like learn okay, you can major in your language but also like do another skill, I don't know, learn like law or politics or medicine or something. Cuz like the best some of the best translation jobs come from people who like yeah they can do translation but they're also people who like I don't know understand biology or medicine or like they have degrees in law. Like this really specialized translation is where you can like it's where it's like the most profitable and you're not going to be like scraping up like pennies like doing just translation odd jobs here and there for like a super low salary or something like that.
yeah, that kind of mirrors what I've heard in the Refold community at large. Like, language ability is a plus for sure, but it's almost never a standalone ability. You have to be able to do something on top of it.
Yeah, exactly.
Now, you tickled me pink one time, Jimmy, when you told me a long time ago about a famous, really big Chinese dating app that you used to do the English localization for. My question for you is, what are your favorite types of jobs to do? Do you enjoy doing dating apps or do you enjoy the literary translation? What's your preferred sort of translation work?
Yeah, I mean, I think I don't know, each type of translation uh presents its own challenges. Of course with apps specifically and like with dating apps, there's like a lot of more colloquial language, and you also have to kind of deal with the limits of the app in some ways. And by that I mean like sometimes I was told like, okay, you have to translate these lines, but you can only do it within like 10 English characters, so it fits into the screen or whatever, because the developers don't want to like accommodate like completely redesign this feature just to fit longer text. And so like it's challenging in that way because like obviously when you're translating like a novel or something, you don't have to worry about those kinds of limitations. And like I've never done subtitle translation, but I hear it's the same as well with like subtitles. Is like you have to get your translation down into a certain length or something like that. Whereas with um, literary translation, like I definitely enjoy that because I not only get to read some literary works that maybe I wouldn't have come across or known about myself, and I get to present that to a native English speaking audience or just a more like an audience in general who can't speak Chinese, and just sort of introduce some new literary perspectives. And so I kind of like how each sort of domain of translation presents its own challenges. And so I don't know if I necessarily have like a favorite, but I just kind of enjoy them all in their own ways.
All right. Well, yeah, that makes sense. Each type of translation takes a slightly different skill, different mindset, and yeah, I think I can appreciate that. It's why one or the other, why not both?
What I want to know is what's the editorial process like from start to finish? So when you get a job, how is it that you work through that job? Like you get a like a script or a transcript or a novel or a passage, and then you translate it. And what does that process look like from start to finish?
Sure. So, yeah, again, of course, it depends on the type of translation you're doing in the company. Back when I did translation for the dating app, they had their own sort of online translation system where I would just like log in and then it would have it line by line of all the stuff I had to translate, and there would maybe be like a screenshot attached of like the app itself so I could have more context. And so I would translate like that. Like, of course, if I needed more context, I would just ask my boss, and then they would review my translations, and like if everything looked okay, they would just approve it, and I wouldn't really hear anything more from them about it. Like if they needed something changed, they would just notify me about that. And then with literary translation, typically how it works is, um, especially since like I'm not uh, like I'm still quite young. I'm not as experienced as like some of the super serious literary translators. So typically, what uh, like the people I work with do is they first send me like maybe the first chapter or the first 1,000 characters of a story, and then they have me translate that as like a sample just to like make sure there's no issues, and then they give me the full work. And so, as a recent example, I guess I did some nonfiction translation earlier this year, uh, and it was like a book length translation. And so after I did the sample translation, they like, they approved of my work, and they sent me uh, the entire file, and they gave me around 4 months to complete the entire uh, translation. And so, at least with this company specifically, this publishing company, they just, you know, entrust that I'll complete it in time. They check in on me every once in a while. But other than that, it's like, I just work on my own. Of course, if I have any like issues or like need some more, I don't know, context or something, I can contact them. Because it depends on the publishing company, and also depends on what you're translating. Sometimes you may have access to the author, and you might be allowed to contact the author and like ask them for more context or more information. But at least so far for me, when I've done fiction translation, I haven't had access to the original author, so I've just kind of been on my own, just me and of course the publisher I can contact. And then after that, I handed the translation into them. They do their own proofreading. I believe this, as far as I know, the publishing company that I do this work for, they employ some native English proofreaders, and so they'll go through that. And if there's anything they need me to change, they'll just contact me, send it back, um, and then after that, it eventually gets, it goes through the motions and it gets published. But I'm not too sure on the specifics on how it works after the proofreading stage is over.
Gotcha. And while you're doing the actual translation work, you have your Chinese manuscript in front of you and you're translating into English. Do you have any special tools or programs or applications that you use while doing the translating?
Yeah, so it depends on the type of translation that I'm doing. One important tool for a lot of translators, and I mean you can still use it in literary translation if you wanted to, but I tend to not use it as much with literary translation. Is what's called a CAT tool, a computer assisted translation tool. And what this is it's a sort of tool that helps make translation easier. It has like a database where like if you translate a word one way, you can save that into the database, and the next time you encounter that word, it'll bring up your previous translation, so everything is sort of like uniform and in line, and you're not translating the same thing in a different way that makes it seem weird. And then it also has like the ability to split up your translation like line by line, so you give it a Word document, and then it gives you the uh like each sentence line by line to make it kind of easier on you. And then of course, like if you have a project manager or something, they can sort of view your translation and approve it or whatever. And so that's something that you see a lot, especially like a lot of translators use these tools nowadays. It's You're not necessarily just opening up a Word document and typing your translation, although that is something that you can definitely do that, and that's like more common, I guess I would say, in literary translation, because you're not with literary translation, especially with Chinese, you're kind of wanting to look at the work as a whole, or like a paragraph as a whole, as opposed to looking at things line by line. Because if you just translate like literature line by line, then you risk it sounding kind of awkward and not flowing as well as the
Right.
original text. And so, besides that, I also use, of course, dictionary. Um, I have a bunch of physical dictionaries, but I don't really use them all that much, because like most of the dictionaries I need are just available digitally, and so I have my laptop in front of me usually, and then next to me I have an iPad where I load up all my uh, Chinese dictionaries, and so yeah, those are, I guess, the main tools that I use personally.
Awesome. That sounds really cool. And you mentioned that most people, or you in particular, don't use the translation tool for literary fiction. Do you use any different tools for literary fiction, or just mostly a dictionary in your brain?
Yeah, I haven't really spoken too much with other literary translators, but yeah, personally, what I do for literary translation is, well, I mean, there's a few approaches you can use. Like, one is like, first you read the work in its entirety without translation, and then you translate it. Another approach is like, you just read it like paragraph by paragraph and do the translation then.
And which do you prefer?
Uh, in an ideal circumstance, I would always prefer the first method, but sometimes, because
Right.
of time constraints or whatever, it's might not necessarily be all that realistic. It just depends on how much time the publisher gives you. But um, yeah, with my own literary translation process, it's, yeah, just basically like reading through it, then doing the translation. Just, yeah, using my brain, go, using a dictionary when necessary. If there's like some like line that like makes zero sense, especially that happened like a few times, definitely during when I was translating some politic stuff, or like agricultural stuff. I'll just ask like the publishing company, or ask some like native friends to help provide some context.
So I have a question for you. If you're not using the software to assist you in translation, have you ever run into an instance where like you accidentally start translating something like a term slightly differently, like later on, and then there's this sort of mismatch? Because I've seen that before in amateur translations. For example, like here at Refold, we have volunteer translations, and sometimes one translator will use a slightly non-standard term or a different term than the other translators. And even with the same person, they might phrase something a different way on a different day. How do you avoid that?
Yeah, so I mean, of course, this is one of the big advantages of cat tools, is that they let you avoid this problem. But if you're not using a cat tool, I mean, you can always just kind of, I don't know, you could write it down. You could use a spreadsheet in Excel to sort of make a glossary. Um, and then another important part is just like doing your own proofreading, and not entirely relying on the publishing company's proofreading. Of course, this also depends on, again, time constraints, and whatnot, and how much time you have. But personally, with me, since I used to do proofreading for the same publishing company, so I'm kind of like obsessive about my own proofreading my own work. I make sure all the references like match and everything, and so um, a lot of that is just like up to the individual translator and their own workflow. But just kind of, you know, I guess this is kind of a case where like having that like sort of obsessive, sort of like perfectionist personality um, is an advantage, because lets you go through your translation and sort of like just see where things might not match up.
All right.
So I had a question. I was curious about what kind of role translation has played throughout your language journey. So I think you mentioned that you started translation when you were like a solid stage 4, and that was like part time or doing like free work for people, and if like translation is your current full time job or if it's still a part time thing and you do something else. Like, I'm wondering what the balance is.
Yeah, so um for me personally, translation has always just kind of been mainly like a side thing. I do have some classmates who are doing their best to get into translation full time, or they often like work in interpretation because interpretation is often a lot easier to find jobs in some cases a lot better paid. Um, but yeah, for me personally, it's always just been translation has always been sort of a part time thing or a side thing. And then yeah, right now with this literary translation, it's still more of a side thing. And then because my main thing right now is just focusing on my master's degree here, and doing that. And so translation is just something I do kind of like in my free time or like during my school breaks or whatever.
So, would you be comfortable answering what your full time work is and how translation fits into it?
Um, yeah, I mean, I don't have a full time work right now. I just focus entirely on grad school, and like I like have some scholarships or whatever to support me here.
Oh,
But
gotcha.
yeah,
It's
yeah.
basically full-time job. I mean, you're working
Yeah,
and that's
that makes a lot of
that
sense.
occupies most of your time.
Yeah. So, how far are you away from completing your school?
I am. I still have about a year and a half. I just started uh earlier this year, and so it's like a 2 year degree, and then I'll I'll be finished with the degree after that.
Okay, so do you have plans for a specific job whenever you finish, or are you just seeing what happens when you graduate?
Yeah. So my current plan is to continue staying in Taiwan after I finish the master's degree, and I'll be applying for um political science PhD programs here in Taiwan, and so that's sort of my goal after that. So obviously that definitely has nothing to do with translation, but I don't know. I guess I'll just keep up translation as something I do on the side.
So you just want to get all the degrees that are out there.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I just enjoy like doing research and continuing to learn. And yeah, like I said, like this is like something you see in a lot of translators is there are always people who like love learning and like never want to stop learning. And so like if you're that type of person who is just kind of like obsessive about like learning new things and like reading a lot, that's like a good quality to have if you want to become a translator.
Well, that makes a lot of sense.
So, Jimmy, you mentioned that or you originally like wanted to be a translator and really like make a proper career out of it, and that
Mhm.
you since shifted your perspective. Was that due to the nature of translation work being underpaid, not very stable, you're not very likely to be like an in-house translator? Or was it just because you're like, I really don't like translation that much? Was it the industry itself, or was it like the actual job that caused you to shift your sort of your focus? And
Yeah, that's a good question. I would say it's a mixture of both. On one hand, it's sort of the industry where it's like underpaid and like, plenty of companies would rather go with like a mediocre translator than a good translator just to save some money here and there. And so uh I mean, this can also be different for other countries, I imagine as well. But that's kind of sort of the situation as it is in China, because I think I believe in some European countries, like if you want to work as a translator, you actually need to like become like a official certified translator and like have certain qualifications or pass certain tests. But it's not really like that in China, or like there are some tests, but they're that you can take and they do help in some ways, but they're not necessary for getting jobs there. Again, also just translation itself. I don't know. I've always kind of had like a love hate relationship with it. Like sometimes I tell myself like, okay, I'm gonna quit translation after I finish translating this book. But then the publishing company comes back to me with like an even more interesting book to translate for my next project. So I'm like, all right, whatever, I'll just keep doing it. Um, but yeah, and I mean the other thing with translation is, I mean, it sounds obvious, but it's something that like you don't really know whether you'll enjoy it or not until you actually do it. Because with translation, you're always translating other people's ideas. You're not really translating your own. You're not formulating your own original ideas. Although, of course, translation does involve a creative element. And the saying kind of goes like, when you're reading an author in translation, you're kind of not really reading the author. You're reading the translator's work. But yeah, I kind of prefer like how like I switched to politics again because I kind of like how I can produce my own work, my own sort of original research and thoughts, and so that's kind of one of the reasons why I didn't want to pursue translation full time is like I didn't want to just be translating other people's thoughts and ideas all day long.
Interesting. Now, I've talked to you before, but just to clarify, in addition to having worked as a translator, you also know a bit of web dev, right? You've done that professionally as well.
Right.
So you kind of have a whole bunch of different talents. You are a translator, you're a grad student going on PhD student, and you're a professional translator who has done literary and other types of translation. And yeah, that's a lot of very unique skills to have, I think. So what made you not go into like taking your web dev further? Why politics? Why I assume you freelance. I assume you're not salaried. I assume you're a contractor with your translation jobs.
Right. Right. Yeah.
So why not be a freelance web dev? Why stick with translation with the industry being how it is if you have other skills that are also, something you can use to make money remotely while you're in Taiwan?
Yeah, I mean, I did, yeah, I did, I previously did, web dev. Like, I got into sort of like programming in general back when I was like 12 or 13 and kind of just kept that up as a teenager. And then, like, when I arrived in college, I used to do web dev for the Chinese department there, developing some educational websites and resources for them. Um, and I mean, I did enjoy web dev in some ways, in like programming and whatnot, but I don't know. I kind of don't enjoy it that much anymore. Of course, it's a well compensated job, um, but I don't know. I kind of just prefer with translation. Although it has its cons, I do prefer how like I'm always able to be reading stuff in my target language and continuing to, especially with literary translation, because one of my major hobbies, just like in my free time, is reading Chinese literature. And so, the fact that I can kind of like do that and get paid for it is quite a nice advantage. Um, and yeah, I mean, I don't know. Programming is quite fun, but like it doesn't really help me with Chinese or I don't know politics or anything like that in any way. And so I kind of prefer my current path, even though programming or web dev would definitely be a lot better paid.
For sure. So while I have you here and you have the stage, uh, I know that you have sort of this interesting, I don't know what it's called, not a tagline, catchphrase. You have this interesting catchphrase, read the news. Do you want to explain to the world why you tell people to read the news?
Yeah, I mean, I've been meaning to make a video on this for a while, but I haven't gotten around to it yet. But I always tell people like you should read the news in your target language. I mean, of course, like if you're someone who absolutely like hates the news or whatever, like has no interest in it, then okay, like don't do it. That's fine. Um, but for me personally, reading the news was immensely helpful for my Chinese. Like reading the news kind of helped me take my Chinese from like just being able to talk about like daily life things or like basic conversation things to like being able to talk about like economics and politics and other stuff with my friends. And I mean, I've always been someone who likes reading the news like in English, and so that kind of naturally translated over into uh, Chinese as well. And I mean, with the news, like I tell people, like, you know, if you want to be fluent in uh, the language that you're learning, like, you should have the ability to, comprehend news articles and whatnot. Because like any, native speaker who is like, a high school graduate will have no problem reading news articles. Because of course, news articles are targeted at the general populace. They're not sort of targeted at like, just academics or whatever. And so being able to read news articles has that sort of component to it. And I mean, with news, you can also there's many domains, and like people do get overwhelmed. Like, they say like I've read all these news articles, but I'm still coming across like 100 new words every day. But like you can just focus on one domain with news at a time. Like read politics news for a while, and then I don't know, go into economics, and then if you want to go into I don't know science or something like that, you can kind of narrow down your domains like that, which makes it easier to go through. And of course, uh, people like in general, like I mean, of course, it depends on your friend group, but like just a lot of people in general like talk about like what happened recently, like what's the recent news, and people have their discussions and debates about stuff like that. And so it also like if you have like native friends, it's something to that you can discuss with them.
All right, good answer.
So if you
And
want to be a translator, read the news because you can
read
narrow
the
your
news.
domains. Read the news. If you want to do anything in your target language, read the news. I was gonna ask what domains you thought would be great for people to focus on if they're interested in translation, and I love that that literally just answered my question. I do have another question though for you. If people are interested in translation, what qualities do you think make a good translator? Like, what are some things that would set somebody up for success in translating qualities?
So I would say one of the first things is um yeah, like I mentioned before, like, if you're someone who loves learning and reading a lot, because
Mhm.
of course with translation you have to do a lot of research. You might have to research into like some cultural references or just historical references, and so like it's not like you're just like sitting down and just like looking at text and like translating all the time. Like another portion of your time is also dedicated to doing background research, because like obviously even if you're like a native speaker and you're like going through a book or something, like you're not going to understand every single historical reference or something unless you're like I don't know, a historian or something like that. And so you have to like look this stuff up and like understand it and figure out how to make the reader understand it as well. And so besides like a love of learning and reading, I would also say just having you want to be of course a good writer in your native language. um you want to be sort of you have to kind of be I don't know, you flexible and creative, of course, to an extent. Like you can't just be doing like word for word translations. You kind of have to like think like how do I make things flow naturally while still being faithful to the source text. um and Yeah, I guess those would definitely be a lot of the main qualities, and especially if you're in doing like freelance translation as well, like you want to be, you know, punctual on time. That's a hugely
Right.
important thing in the translation industry is you don't
Deadlines.
want to turn things late. Yeah.
Right. That makes a lot of sense. So to, I guess, like summarize, it would be have a passion for learning, be inquisitive, have a good attention to detail while not getting lost in the details, and being able to convey the bigger picture, if you will. And then, in addition to having a passion for your target language, having a passion for your native language as well, and really enjoy writing in that language.
Right.
Yeah. And so let's say somebody has all those qualities and they're looking to get into translating. What advice would you give to someone who wants to start down the road of translation in their target language? Like, if that's their goal, what would you recommend them to do to do that?
Yeah, so I mean, most people would probably start off with freelance translation by finding jobs online. So there are like some websites that are used by a lot of free translators. ProZ is probably the main one. It's like a job posting website where like people who need translations or companies that need translations find translators, and you can like submit your resume or do a sample translation for them. Of course, the main thing is like you need to be building up your translation network, and that definitely takes time. Um, your first, perhaps even like your first year or so might not be the easiest because you just need to be building up your reputation. You know, people need to know that you can produce quality translation and translation on time. You need to be finding like clients who pay you well. And there are some good books on this. I don't have the names off the top of my head, but if anybody's interested, I can always send the names of these like books on like how to get started as a freelance translator. Um, and I mean, besides that, is just you want to be constantly uh, sort of finding new connections, like people who need translations done. I mean, you translate like people ask if like do you need a degree in translation? And I always say like no, you don't need to do that. You don't need to spend money on a translation degree, but of course it does have its benefits in terms of not only networking with professors and classmates, but also just kind of learning the theory behind things, learning what's considered good translation or whatnot, and like whether or not you want to do a degree in translation is kind of your own sort of personal decision. It has its pros and cons for sure.
Awesome. This has been a really interesting conversation. I found myself the whole time just being in total awe of like not only your dedication, but how translation has opened up other interests for you. And I can't wait to see what you do next with your degree in politics and your doctorate. I'm going to be following what you do really closely. Um, just thank you so much for joining us this week. It's been a real pleasure listening to you talking about translating, and I hope that people who have been listening have gotten a good like inside scoop on what the translation industry is like, at least the Chinese to English translation industry. Does anybody else have any final thoughts?
Yeah, I just want to say, thanks everyone for inviting me onto the podcast. And yeah, of course, if anyone has more questions about translation or anything like that, just feel free to contact me on Discord.
And for
And
people
also,
not
if
in the community, that's fighter hashtag 8888. Feel
you
free to
can
reach
also
out.
leave questions in the comments on the recording on YouTube if you're listening to us on YouTube. Feel free to ask, not answer, to ask any questions, and we'll make sure to relay them to Fighter, aka Jimmy, or Jimmy, aka Fighter. All right. So, thank you everyone for joining us for the live recording of the Refold Roundtable podcast. If you love this episode and want to hear more, you can listen to past episodes on YouTube and Spotify. If you enjoyed this episode, please make sure to give us a like and leave a comment to let us know. Voting is now open for next week's topic, so be sure to resuggest topics that didn't win the vote in prior weeks. We don't look back at old suggestions when deciding on topics, so make sure you send them again, and you can suggest those topics in the Refold Discord. And to join the Discord, it's refold.la/join. Thanks again. See you next week.
Thanks for tuning in to this week's episode of the Refold Podcast. We hope you enjoyed listening and maybe even learned something new. Projects, events, and content like this podcast are only possible thanks to our generous patrons. If you liked this and want to see more similar projects, please consider supporting us on Patreon. Visit community.refold.la/patreon-benefits to learn more.